massive. This is a once-in-a-lifetime dynamic shift in general aviation for the good of general aviation.
That's EAA's Sean Elliott talking about the new Mosaic rule that's just been passed. Imagine a future where as you get older and you have to hang up your third class or your BasicMed medical, you suddenly have more airplanes to choose from, not fewer. Under the FAA's new Mosaic rule, sport pilots and private pilots flying under sport pilot privileges can now fly many popular legacy aircraft, including some 182s and Bonanzas, all on just a driver's license. That means older pilots with medical concerns can keep flying comfortably, affordably, and legally while enjoying more flexibility than ever before. In this episode, I talk with EAA's Sean Elliott about how Mosaic makes that possible and about the many other changes the rule has for the Sport Pilot Certificate and for LSA aircraft. And he tells us a story you probably won't hear anywhere else about how Mosaic almost died. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week at episode 394, we talked about the ground collision that destroyed 2 Pasadena Police Department helicopters and what all pilots can learn from that accident. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/394. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Glad you found us. Now, if you would take a moment right now in whatever app that you're using to listen to us, touch the subscribe key, or if you're using Spotify or Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And during the past week, I posted 3 new episodes that brought you highlights from the more than 30 hours of testimony from last week's NTSB investigative hearing into the Reagan National Midair collision that occurred in January. If you listen to those highlights, I'm sure you'll conclude as I did that the roots of that accident go back many years, and this was an accident just waiting to happen. I'll talk more about that later, but in the meantime, to hear those episodes, you need to go search in your podcast app for NTSB News Talk, and you can also find the show online at ntsbnewstalk.com. And my thanks to everybody who supports us via Patreon or through one-time donations via PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle. And if you'd like to hear your name, sign up now to support the show by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And just a quick reminder that if you haven't yet signed up for our Lightspeed giveaway sometime during the year, well, you can't win. And that headset is worth about $1,300. It's a Lightspeed Delta Zulu. So it's not too late. Go on out to the web right now. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/giveaway. And to help you get to that website, you'll find a link on our show notes. And of course, whenever you buy a new Lightspeed headset, Lightspeed will send a check to support Aviation News Talk, but only if you first go to the special link we've set up for you to get to their website. So when you buy, go first to aviationnewstalk.com/lightspeed, which will take you to their website where you can make your purchase. Coming up in the news for the week of August 4th, 2025, the FAA is about to expand drone flights and will tell you why pilots should care. Bonus depreciation for new aircraft is back. And there's always a chance a plane could get stolen once, but twice? We'll tell you what happened and where it happened here in the U.S. All this and more, and the news starts now. From IOWorldToday.com, FAA unveils rule to expand drone flights in the National Airspace System. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy announced a proposed FAA rule that would normalize beyond visual line of sight, which is sometimes called BVLOS, drone operations, making the flights safer and more secure. The rule announced Tuesday would allow drones to safely integrate into the NAS, according to the FAA. Operations enabled by BVLOS would include package delivery, agricultural, aerial surveying, public safety, recreation, and flight testing. It would also allow operations at or below 400 feet above the ground from pre-designated and access-controlled locations. Drone operators would need FAA approval to fly in designated areas, outlining boundaries, flight frequency, takeoff and landing zones, loading points, and communication protocols, including procedures for lost connections. Previously, BVLOS drone operations required waivers or exemptions and were approved by the FAA on a case-by-case basis. That would still be the case for proposals for flying multiple drones. Drones would be required to yield to all manned aircraft broadcasting their position, so they don't interfere with airports, heliports, seaplane bases, space launch and re-entry sites or facilities where electrical, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft take off or land. And as a pilot, why should you care? Well, because the traffic below 400 feet AGL is about to get a lot denser. For example, I'm part of a local pilot project, and as part of that testing, I've had 14 drone deliveries to my house. And I'll post a video of today's delivery as our video of the week, and I'll tell you how to find that in our updates section after the news. From flyingmag.com, bonus depreciation for aircraft is back. A recently passed bill in Congress reinstates a permanent 100% immediate deduction for qualifying business assets, overturning the planned phase-out that was set to reduce bonus depreciation to 40% by 2025. Aircraft used predominantly for business purposes, like executive travel or charter operations, will qualify under this provision. Companies can take an immediate tax deduction on newly acquired or used aircraft placed in service after January 19, 2025. For any companies that rely on business jets for executive travel, charter services, and other essential operations, bonus depreciation substantially cuts the effective purchase price of high-value aircraft and improves cash flow by reducing tax liabilities. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilots attempt to break in new engine ends in crash. This comes from a final NTSB report. The pilot told investigators the Cessna 172H had recently had an engine upgrade, so that would be a bigger engine that burns more fuel, and he was flying it to break in the engine. He had performed fuel calculations based on its previous consumption rate and did not realize the new engine was consuming more fuel than planned. During final approach, the airplane experienced a total loss of power due to fuel exhaustion. The pilot performed a forced landing on an open field near Santa Rosa, California, with high vegetation, substantially damaging the right wing and right horizontal stabilizer. Probable cause: the pilot's inadequate fuel management, which resulted in a total loss of engine power due to fuel exhaustion. And we read about engine failures and pilots running out of gas all the time. Now we're starting to see people run out of energy in electric airplanes. This comes from flightsafety.org. This happened near Morlaix Airport in France. It involved a Pipistrel Velis Electro. The report, which is very brief, says the electric aircraft had to make an emergency landing in a field after suddenly losing engine power. The two pilots of the two-seater aircraft were unharmed. There's a photo on Facebook showing the aircraft upside down, and on the side of the plane it says Green Aero Lease. So I checked out their website, and it says that they're the world's first electric aircraft lessor. Quote, with several thousand flight hours under our belt, we now have the experience needed to provide a quality rental service. You can contact us directly via our contact form for more information regarding the terms of our rental service. Today, we have deployed more than 30 electric planes in aero clubs and pilot schools across Europe. If you're interested in flying an electric plane, you can inquire with the aero clubs and pilot schools near you. So, an interesting business model and a new way to lose power in an aircraft. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a new life for Cirrus parachutes. Now, this is a novel idea. It says Cirrus has introduced a collection of handcrafted aviation-inspired travel bags using material repurposed from the Cirrus airframe parachute system or caps. The bags are handmade by Duluth Pack, the oldest canvas and leather bag maker in the U.S., and those products include the Pilot Overnighter bag. The collection includes duffel for $255, logbook briefcase for $170, Pilot Overnighter bag for $500, and it says Cirrus parachutes used in the lining are composed of Kevlar, nylon, and Vectran cordage. The parachute itself spans 2,349 square feet with a diameter of 54 feet and contains cord stretching over a mile long. From AOPA.org, in Alaska, CTAF frequencies are now regional. Alaska has developed an adaptation to standard radio procedures with the aim of improving safety. Some areas in the state have high concentrations of airports. These areas often have high volumes of air traffic, but without the benefit of a control tower or airspace requiring two-way communication. In response to some tragic mid-air collisions, the FAA worked with aviation industry groups to develop the concept of using a common traffic advisory frequency to cover a geographic area rather than an individual airport. The convention of an area-based CTAF is unique to Alaska and not routinely depicted on aeronautical charts. So, how are pilots supposed to find out when they are entering a CTAF area not associated with an airport? The information is published in the Notices section of the Alaska Chart Supplement, but recently Alaska Flight Service has posted a set of diagrams depicting these larger areas on its website. CTAFs are designed for use while operating to and from non-towered airports. According to the AIM, pilots are expected to monitor and communicate on a CTAF within 10 miles of the airport they are operating to or from. Private airstrips are very popular in Alaska, where the lack of roads makes airplanes an essential means of transportation. For example, in one valley in south-central Alaska, there are over 200 registered airports and landing areas. Initially, airports were assigned one or another of CTAF frequencies. However, this resulted in a situation where two aircraft, headed to nearby airstrips, could share the same airspace while monitoring different CTAFs. Today, designated CTAF areas are found in several locations where high volumes of traffic are known to operate, often without the benefit of radar coverage to provide VFR flight following. However, the solution isn't perfect. On busy flying days, frequency congestion becomes a problem. Consequently, pilots need to be concise when reporting their location and intentions. And finally, from autos.yahoo.com, plane stolen twice in 1 week begs the question, just how easy is it to steal a plane? It says plane theft is an exceedingly rare crime. However, one plane owner has been figuratively struck by lightning twice. A single Cessna 172 was stolen twice over the past week from two GA airports in Southern California. The aircraft was found and recovered both times, but law enforcement has yet to identify a suspect. It would have been hard to miss Jason Hong's Cessna 172 at Corona Airport. The 75-year-old's plane is painted in distinctive red, orange, yellow, and blue stripes. It's not clear how or when the Cessna departed the airport, but Hong contacted the Corona Police Department once he realized the plane was gone. The single-engine plane was found parked at another airport, Brackett Field, 17 miles away. Hong realized that the plane's battery was dead when he went to retrieve it. He told the airport's manager he'd come back in a few days with a fully charged battery. However, the plane went missing again. The Cessna was found at San Gabriel Valley Airport in El Monte, roughly 12 miles west of downtown LA, by the El Monte Police Department. Patrol officers found the plane parked on the tarmac and chained to a bolt. According to KNBC, an eyewitness saw a woman with a plane at the airport. According to KVVU, a string of plane thefts in 2024, 3 of them over 6 weeks, across the entire country, led to an increase in scrutiny over its poor security at GA airports. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk with Sean Elliott about what you need to know about the new Mosaic rule. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Patreon supporter Mike Marlowe. He writes, Instrument ride passed last week. Listening to your entire back catalog definitely helped with the ground and flight. Thank you. And he also wrote separately, driving to a project I was supervising was actually what got me thinking about getting my certificate. I had to make 6 visits to a place that was a 4-hour round-trip driving, but was about a 5-minute walk from the local airport. Every time I drive by the airport, I thought about how much easier it would be to just fly in there. Well, congratulations to you, Mike, and thanks for your support via Patreon. And if you have good news to share, no, you don't have to be a Patreon supporter to have me share your good news. Just go on out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and we'll be happy to share your news. And now let me tell you about our video of the week. I mentioned during the news that I'm part of a local pilot program that's part of some testing that's being done with a local drone company, and I've had 14 deliveries made to my house in the last month or so by drone. Currently, there are perhaps half a dozen companies in the U.S. that are permitted to fly drones beyond line of sight of the drone pilot, and one of those companies is in my town here. So since it's a pilot program, everything is free. They have only a few items that you can order, and typically I'll order a nice large chocolate bar once or twice a week. Half the fun is eating the chocolate, and the other half is just the novelty of having a drone arrive in my front yard. So if you want to see what that looked like today when the drone showed up, head on out to our Video of the Week page. And by the way, the links for our Videos of the Week is on the same page with links you can use to become a supporter and start supporting this show. So when you go to view the videos, look at the bottom of the page for the video links. And at the top of the page, you'll see 4 options listed for supporting this show. So to get to that page, to see our Videos of the Week or to support the show, go online to aviationnewstalk.com/video. And now let me tell you how I spent much of the past week. I spent 3 full days listening to the NTSB hearings into the mid-air collision over the Potomac of an Army Black Hawk helicopter and a regional jet in January that killed 67. There was over 30 hours of testimony, with the final day Friday wrapping up at 10 p.m. I then spent quite a bit of time creating 3 episodes of my NTSB News Talk podcast, 1 episode for each day of the hearing, which contained the highlights of that day's testimony. And here are some of my thoughts on the accident. It was clear to me that there were at least 10 minor failures in different areas, which, when all stacked up, eroded safety margins to 0 and led to the accident. And it truly was an accident just waiting to happen. And frankly, all of the organizations involved need to do better. Now, it would be easy to blame the pilots and the controllers who were involved that night, but the testimony showed that the roots of the accident goes back years and involved many small, seemingly unrelated decisions in different organizations. Some of those issues were in plain sight and readily identifiable, and others were invisible and found only because of the investigation. For example, there have been recommendations to lower the arrival rates at which aircraft enter Reagan National Airport's airspace because controllers felt they were having to handle too many airplanes. In one case, an FAA manager said it was not a good time to bring that up, as the FAA reauthorization bill was pending in front of Congress. Now, no record was found of that safety-related recommendation making it higher up the management chain, despite an FAA policy that requires it be passed along. An invisible issue was that 7 of the 8 Lima version Black Hawk helicopters in the U.S. Army 12th Battalion's fleet were incapable of transmitting ADS-B out signals, apparently due to the incorrect entry of a timing parameter in the aircraft software. Another issue was that Sikorsky didn't document in the Black Hawk's pilot operating manual that when in flight, altimeter altitudes displayed were less accurate because of rotor downwash. Now, in an NTSB test of 3 of the 12th Battalion's helicopters, the altitudes in flight were off by as much as 80 to 130 feet. Now, that rarely matters in a typical flight environment where Army aviators are looking outside most of the time to separate themselves from terrain and other aircraft. But it mattered a lot when flying at night on a helicopter route that was as little as 75 feet below the arrival path to runway 33. In hindsight, everyone agrees that it was unsafe to have a helicopter route that close to the arrival corridor. Now, in each of these decisions, everybody was doing their job, though in some cases, recommendations were ignored by management, and some of the testimony was that management needs to listen more to workers. Everyone who testified wants the system to work. And a key phrase that came up repeatedly during interviews of DCA tower controllers was that we, quote, just make it work. Now, what that meant wasn't clearly explained. I took it to mean that the controllers work to squeeze more airplanes onto the runways when their arrival rates are higher than normal. But there's plenty of blame to be shared for high arrival rates. Congress has passed bills that approved more landing slots at Reagan National, which ultimately led to more arrivals. And the airlines aren't blameless either. They are limited to a certain number of arrivals each hour, but they play games by compressing their arrivals into the last portion of a prior hour and the first portion of the next hour. For example, a controller said, and I'm quoting here, he said, if you look at the hours from 9 to 10 and 10 to 11 and 11 to 12, they're meeting a rate of 32, 31, 33, let's say, which is the appropriate rate. But if I were to pull the time from 9:30 to 10:30 and 10:30 to 11:30, I'll see numbers that range from 40-something all the way up to above 70. Now, at LaGuardia Airport, this behavior has been mitigated by specifying maximum arrivals per half hour rather than per hour. At the time of the accident, the FAA arrival rate was 32 aircraft per hour at Reagan. Currently, it's 30 per hour. A couple of times during the hearings, NTSB board members said rather emphatically, do better. It left me wondering, how do people who are seemingly already doing their jobs do better? Well, I think one way is by continuing to advocate for particular changes, even when management pushes back. Now, that takes courage, and what we really need is a system where people aren't punished for being outspoken. And another way is that management in all of these organizations, not just the FAA, needs to listen more carefully and trust that what workers tell them is important. It's easy to get sucked into believing that the absence of accidents indicates a system is safe, especially since we haven't had a major accident for over 15 years. But safety is not a static state that once you achieve it, lets you rest on your laurels. Now, we live, as you know, in a noisy, dynamic world where things are constantly changing, and change introduces new hazards. So we constantly have to be looking for those. We all need to own a piece of safety, and we all need to do better. So if you would, please search in your favorite podcast app for NTSB News Talk podcast. Listen to those episodes I did about the hearings and share whatever thoughts you have about that accident with me. And I want to talk about an accident that occurred in 2023. It was a Cessna 172 on August 4th, about noontime at Pembroke Pines, Florida. This comes from the final NTSB report. It says, the flight instructor and two passengers were departing for a local flight when the accident occurred. Airport security video showed that shortly after the takeoff roll, the airplane rotated and lifted off normally, but the airplane's pitch rapidly increased during the initial climb, which continued to an altitude of about 125 feet. The airplane then began a roll to the left that quickly developed into a steep descent to impact with the flat terrain on airport property. Post-accident examination of the airframe and engine revealed that the propeller blades exhibited damage signatures indicative of engine power during impact. The cockpit front seat rails and their associated seat frame latches displayed no anomalies or evidence of aft seat slippage that would account for the high pitch angle during initial climb, and the weight and balance was within limits. The examination did not reveal evidence of any pre-impact mechanical malfunctions or failures of the flight controls or other airframe components that would preclude normal operations. The surviving passenger could not recall any details about the flight, and there was no onboard recording electronic data available for review. A video study was performed using security video footage and concluded that during takeoff and initial climb, there was a large wing angle of attack preceding a bank to the left. Immediately before the left bank, the AOA was estimated to be 14.5 degrees. When the aircraft started banking to the left, its ground speed was a constant 61 knots, which I'll point out is well below VY in a Cessna 172. Given this information, it's likely that during the initial climb, the airplane exceeded its critical angle of attack, which resulted in a power-on dynamic stall and subsequent loss of control at an altitude that was too low to recover. Probable cause: the flight instructor's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during the initial climb, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and subsequent rapid descent into terrain. Now, here's the really interesting part of the report. It says, the operator reported that the purpose of the flight was an introductory instructional flight, but, according to family members of the passengers, the purpose of the flight was not instructional flight, but was instead a scenic tour of downtown Miami, Florida. One of the passengers occupied the front left seat, the CFI occupied the right front seat, and the other passenger occupied a rear seat. Neither of the passengers held pilot certificates, and there was no luggage. Following the accident, the surviving rear seat passenger was unable to recall any details about the flight. The CFI who died in the crash was a 31-year-old male with an estimated 900 hours total time in all aircraft, 98 hours of which were in the prior 90 days and 24 hours in the prior 30 days. So, two things stand out. In my opinion, it's quite likely this was a sightseeing flight and that the flight school might not have had authorization to give sightseeing flights, which could explain the disconnect between the reported purposes of the flight. And the second thing is that the aircraft was clearly pitched too high and its airspeed was too low. Now, the CFI had 900 hours, so I'm sure he knew the correct VY speed, which for this older model 172 was probably around 73 knots. And he probably knew that typically one wouldn't pitch more than about 10 degrees at most in a climb in a 172, which begs the question, why, if he knew all this, would he end up pitching so high with an airspeed that low? Now, the NTSB addresses the what of an accident, and what we're asking is about the why of the accident. Unless there were a video or audio recording inside the cockpit, we'll never know for sure the why of the accident. We can only speculate. Given the circumstances, I can think of two possibilities. One is that the CFI was distracted during the flight. This is so common that the NTSB has listed distractions as one of the major reasons for loss of control of an aircraft. The other possibility that comes to mind is that the left seat passenger somehow interfered with the controls of the airplane. Perhaps the CFI was talking the passenger through how to take off, and the passenger over-rotated and was so strong on the controls that the CFI was unable to overpower them. I recently talked about this kind of situation and suggested that using your elbow might get someone to release the controls. Now, a listener who heard that suggested an even better idea. He said that the CFI could use one hand to cover the eyes of the left seat passenger, and in most cases, the passenger would then release the controls, and the CFI could control the plane with her right hand. And I mention this because these kinds of situations do occur. And as a pilot, or especially as a CFI, it pays to have thought through these kinds of situations ahead of time so that when they do come up, you'll know what to do. And here's a follow-up regarding the Bristol B-23 Energic electric airplane that I test flew earlier in the summer. I just read that they did some noise measurements on the plane while it was at the Centennial Airport just south of Denver, and they say that the plane was so quiet that it flew without triggering 3 of 6 official noise monitoring sensors. So 3 of the 6 sensors recorded no noise because the B-23 flew below ambient sound thresholds of 60 dB. The remaining sensors registered the B-23 Energic at 1/10 of the intensity of the noise measured in comparison to the piston aircraft. So one benefit of electric aircraft that we don't talk about a lot is that they're quieter. And here's a short, fun article from Flying Magazine written by my friend Meg Guadaluski, a CFI who I've known for close to 20 years. And it looks like this may have been a question that was submitted by a reader. The title is ground instruction required before you fly? And it says, question, I started flight training 10 years ago, getting a medical and everything, and logged about 6 hours, then life got in the way. Recently, I bought a Cessna 152, and I'm trying to find a CFI who will just go up with me so I can see if I like it or not before I commit. So far, all the CFIs I've flown with insist on doing some ground before we fly. I've told them I won't pay for ground. Is there an FAA rule that states a flight instructor has to do ground instruction with a client before they fly? And here's Meg's answer. There's no rule, but before each flight there should be a pre-flight briefing where you and your CFI discuss what you will be doing on the flight. Ground instruction is necessary as you could be learning how to do a pre-flight inspection using the checklist, how to get and interpret a weather briefing, and how to determine aircraft weight and balance and aircraft performance. These things are done before every flight, and I mean every flight. You don't learn them by osmosis, and you definitely shouldn't skip them. The fact that you refuse to pay for ground may be the reason that you're having a problem finding a CFI. Now, to me, the question raises a few red flags, and I don't think I would take on that person as a client. If they're so focused on costs and cutting corners of the traditional flight training process, they're the kind of person that could end up in an accident, and frankly, who wants their name in the logbook of a pilot who crashes? And to that, I would add that pilots should expect to pay for all of the time that an instructor spends with them, working with them, and not just the time the Hobbs meter is turning. And I think the norms have changed in that area. 50 years ago, when I was getting my private, I just paid the CFI for Hobbs time. But these days, that seems to be the exception rather than the norm. So overall, interesting article. Coming up next, our conversation with Sean Elliott about Mosaic and the many impacts it's going to have on the Sport Pilot Certificate, Sport Pilot Privileges, and the light sport aircraft. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Sean Elliott. Sean joined EAA in 1966 as executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors. Later, he led EAA's aircraft operations and air tours as director of aircraft operations. And for the past 15 years, he's been vice president of advocacy and safety, and he manages EAA's government affairs offices at both EAA headquarters and in Washington, D.C. And now here's our conversation with Sean Elliott. Sean, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Max. Great to be here.
Well, it's been more than a decade since I've seen you, so it's great to reconnect here. We're going to talk about Mosaic today, and I got to admit, when I first started digging into this, I really didn't understand it much at all, and yet I find it has a lot of impacts on a lot of pilots. Before we get into some of those impacts, tell us a little bit about how Mosaic almost died.
Well, it was literally a almost 10-year effort from the beginning concepts and sharing strategies and ideas with the FAA, and then ultimately developing into a rulemaking priority and then a rulemaking package. As you just mentioned, throughout that span, it did nearly die 3 separate occasions. And to me, the most interesting of those 3 is the final situation that occurred literally in 2023. As we started AirVenture, we have a fairly significant government host team at EAA that focuses on hosting our FAA folks that are here on the grounds and sharing our priorities and our advocacy work. Well, at the beginning of that week, we had gotten intel through some of the senior FAA execs that were already here that there was a high likelihood that Mosaic was going to get shelved. Basically put on the shelf and the focus was going to be shift to other priorities. Well, we got together as a team and we determined what we could do throughout the week of activities to really open the aperture from within the FAA and show all of the senior folks, including the administrator, Billy Nolan, who was here that week, then the FAA administrator, Billy Nolan, why Mosaic could be so impactful and to show them reality, real world examples of what Mosaic could and would mean to finish this as a rule package. And with the work that we did and the power of AirVenture with all the breadth and depth of general aviation that's here, unlike any other aviation event in the world, we were able to create some impactful interactions for the agency. And by the Thursday Meet the FAA Administrator session at Theater in the Woods, Billy Nolan actually announced that Mosaic was going to become their number 1 priority, and they would have an NPRM out by the following August in 2024. So to turn it around from nearly dead to now it's a top priority, what a significant moment that was for all of us that had put so much energy and effort into seeing this become a reality. It was just very gratifying to see the FAA recognize what we were trying to help them understand and come out the end of that week in 1 week span to turn it from nearly dead to holy cow, it's now going to become a top priority within FAA. And darn it, they actually delivered. By July of 2024, they had the NPRM out.
That's fascinating. I don't think that this could have happened probably in any other venue. If you think about it, it's really unique that any group of people gets to spend 5 days or a week with senior officials from the FAA. Talk briefly about AirVenture as a tool for interacting with the FAA and affecting significant change.
Yeah, you bet, Max. So while everybody else is enjoying the week of AirVenture and looking upwards and skywards at some of the amazing aircraft that are here and displays that are here, we bury ourselves for the entire week inside 4 walls and every day go through multiple different interactions and meetings with all of the different facets of the agency, whether it's flight standards or aircraft certification or aviation safety. You name the different parts of the FAA. We have throughout the week just buried with them, really getting meaningful work done on all of the initiatives that the organization has. And then we have a touch point throughout the year, obviously in DC, and then our winter FAA summit that occurs in the February-March timeframe is our other end of the bookends, called AirVenture, the main bookend. But then our winter summit is where we continue to follow up on all those initiatives and efforts. And it's, as I said, it's such an impactful way to do that because they're outside of the DC arena. They're in an environment that truly reminds them why their work is so important and why general aviation is so important. And we're able to accomplish a lot more because of that.
Well, and you also get to show them some fun as well. I bet they enjoy not being in offices in DC and get to watch airplanes fly.
Well, they do. And in addition to meeting with us, they also have one-stop shopping for all of the different constituencies that they interact with, whether it be aircraft manufacturers or avionics manufacturers or, name your entity, they're all here. So they're able to move around the grounds and set up different meetings throughout the week that, again, create a much more, you couldn't duplicate that in any other form other than AirVenture.
Well, let's go ahead and start with something that may impact some of our listeners the most. Certainly, as pilots get older, they start to think about, will I pass my medical? And if I am thinking about continuing to fly for a long time, how can I do that? What capabilities, what airplanes can I still fly? I think probably the biggest impact of Mosaic for older pilots is they're going to get to be able to continue to fly more capable airplanes than they would have prior to Mosaic. Talk a little bit about the different capabilities that pilots will still have if they back off from, say, standard private flying abilities with a third-class medical. What can they back down to from there in various steps?
Well, that is absolutely one of the most impactful elements of Mosaic as a new pathway. Basically, any level of pilot certificate held, should you run into a situation where you would rather go down the road of flying as exercising the privileges of a sport pilot and flying an aircraft that meets the definition of a sport pilot eligible aircraft, you can do so with a driver's license medical. It's always been that way, but now that the definition has changed so significantly that basically any airplane, standard category, limited category, experimental, any airplane that meets that basic definition of 4 seats, a clean stall speed of 59 knots or less, and a max speed of 250 knots. If you want to operate that using sport pilot privileges, you can do so with a driver's license medical. Now, that means you cannot have had a denied or deferred medical or some known problem. I mean, there's still the basic FARs, right? 61 requires you as a pilot in command to ensure that you're safe and medically fit to fly every time you climb in that cockpit. But this basically untangles so many complex medical processes for older pilots that know that they're safe to fly, have not had a denied or deferred medical, and know that they can meet that basic requirement of I'm fit to fly. It now enables you to do so with the driver's license medical certification, and that's huge. That's a major game changer for those of us that are getting up there in age in the pilot population.
And I guess if your medical has been denied and you're able to go through the entire process to get it reinstated, this pathway now is reopened for you, isn't it?
It is. It is. So that's a great point. Less than 1% of denials stay denied for those that pursue the special issuance process. So it's absolutely, now that takes time. It's a fair amount of cost associated with that. But once you get that special issuance accomplished, if you have had the denied state, then you're good. And at that point, you can continue to fly either under BasicMed or under Sport Pilot Driver's License Medical for those aircraft that meet that Sport Pilot definition indefinitely. So you just have to go back and get that one-time special issuance accomplished if you've had a denial.
Got it. All right. And so obviously, if you think that you might not pass a medical for some reason, but still feel in good health, you could just choose not to go for your next medical exam and start doing the driver license medical.
Absolutely correct.
Let's continue down this path a little bit. What other kind of limitations would there be for me if I chose to go forward with the driver license medical? You mentioned, for example, 4-seat aircraft. Can I fill all those seats?
No. So that's a great point. Because you're exercising the sport pilot privileges of whatever pilot certificate you hold. I mean, I could even be holding an ATP. And if I go to choose to operate under those limitations, I have to abide by the sport pilot limitations and privileges. So I can only have one passenger. So a pilot and one passenger, 2 occupants to the aircraft, but up to 4 seats and 59 knot clean stall speed, as I mentioned before. And, essentially you can only fly day VFR below 10,000 feet. And then for night time, you do have to have a third class or basic med to be able to operate at night. And if you're only a sport pilot, there's additional training and an endorsement that needs to take place to be able to operate at night as well. But that's new. That's something that has previously never been allowed. So we're excited to see that. But you do have to have the medical component if you're going to fly at night.
You brought up BasicMed, so let's talk about that. That's been available for pilots to kind of step back down to, and it still has even more capabilities than the planes they could fly with just a driver license.
Yeah.
Talk about some of the limitations for pilots that choose to use BasicMed.
So BasicMed has continued to grow and be successful. There are now over 80,000 airmen utilizing BasicMed. That's a phenomenal number. And essentially now, with the recent FAA reauthorization that occurred just a few years ago, BasicMed has been up to aircraft underneath 12,500 pounds and up to 7 seats. So that's probably the widest variety of aircraft that any private operator, recreational pilot, I don't mean rec certificate, I mean someone flying recreationally, could ever hope to operate. And essentially, all you need to do is go to your personal medical physician. It has to be a licensed physician in your state, and have them complete a BasicMed checklist. And then you have to take a course. And there's several offerings of the BasicMed course that every 2 years you have to go through and redo a BasicMed course. But for us, BasicMed, the most significant element of that is it leaves you in the care of your doctor that you have the relationship with. Your doctor that's should know you better than anybody else, that can absolutely help you understand how the best ways to be safe are and fly. That's where BasicMed lands you. You're not with an AME that you see once every couple of years. You're with somebody that you have a relationship with, and to us, that's significant.
Let's go back to sport pilot privileges and talk about some of the specific aircraft models that now someone exercising those privileges could fly with just a driver license. What are some of the ones that would really surprise people that they can now fly using sport pilot privileges?
Well, essentially all the 172s, all of the Piper Cherokees, even up through some of the Archers. Basically, even the Cherokee 180 just made it with 59 knots clean stall speed. The 182 line, some of the early Bonanzas. Now, remember, this also removes any restrictions for complex, high performance, constant speed propeller. All of those things are fair game now, as long as it meets those basic parameters of 59 knots clean and 4 seats. When you really look around the width of and breadth and depth of general aviation, it's about 70% of the single engine piston fleet will now be eligible to be operated by a sport pilot. That doesn't change their certification basis. I can't emphasize that enough. If you have a standard category 172, you still have to maintain it as a standard category 172. So you're going to have an A&P do any maintenance on it. You're going to have to have an A&P with an IA inspection authorization perform and sign off the annual inspection. So those things all still remain in place. It's just now eligible to be operated by a sport pilot.
Yeah, I was kind of stunned when I read that a 182 would be covered by this. And I was just now surprised when you said 70% of the fleet is covered by it.
Yeah.
That really opens up just a huge opportunity for pilots to fly with just a driver license.
Massive. This is a once in a lifetime dynamic shift in general aviation for the good of general aviation. This will increase new student starts. This will help retain pilots further and fly longer that are safe and capable to do so. And it will help keep general aviation vibrant, which, let's face it, when you look around the world, arguably the United States is one of the few countries left that has a truly vibrant general aviation. And this is going to go a long way to keeping that further and further into the future years.
So what does this mean for flight schools and perhaps for flight instructors? How does this change the game for them?
So flight schools, one of the biggest problems with the first iteration of sport pilot and light sport aircraft is flight schools need to go out and buy a specific type of airplane, an LSA, that they didn't have already. And they were costly. They were weight limited. And in many cases, somebody my size would need a flight instructor who was 8 years old. Kidding, of course, but you get the point. The weight was a major limiting factor. And now with this new definition, every flight school has aircraft that are capable of being operated by a sport pilot and training sport pilots already sitting on the ramp. So instant change to allow flight schools to benefit and utilize the sport pilot certificate as a new entry point, especially for those that are teaching folks that are interested in recreational flying. The private's still going to be a very relevant certificate. It's still going to be the go-to certificate for somebody who's pursuing a professional pilot degree or wants to become, an airline pilot. There's no doubt private's the first stepping stone off to higher levels of certificates. But for those that want to fly recreational, sport pilot really is half the cost and half the time to be able to get there and be able to operate that airplane and when the types of operations that a recreational flyer would most likely be engaged in. How often do you have more than one passenger? Not likely very often. How often do you fly other than day VFR below 10,000 feet? Again, recreational, that's a pretty high percentage. So it is going to make sense in so many respects for flight schools to embrace this and utilize this as a new way in. Because again, it really does roll back the price of learning to fly. Our Sport Pilot Academy here at EAA, which arguably is an accelerated academy. We do it in 3.5 weeks, but also other flight schools around the country. We work a lot with Cub Air down in Hartford, Wisconsin, that has a dedicated sport pilot training program, and Piper Cubs right now. Both our operation and Cub Air's, we're seeing an average completion time of between 35 and 40 hours to sport pilot certification. Typically, the students are ready for their check ride by about 35, and then with the check ride, they're coming closer to 40 as a final number for what it took to get that certificate accomplished. I'm sure you know the average time for a private pilot right now, nationwide, is 70 to 80 hours. 70 to 80 hours. I saw a post on one of the blogs here the other day about, well, wait a minute, I'm a sport pilot and it took me 51 hours to get my sport pilot certificate. Well, there are plenty of private pilots to take over 100. So I still think the argument is quite valid that it's truly about half the time and half the cost.
So I think we were probably all surprised after Sport Pilot was first initiated, however many years ago, that there just haven't been that many new sport pilots minted. That is, that most people haven't followed that route. And it sounds like, in a sense, this really allows the sport pilot certificate to become something that people can consider because it's easier to do. You've got access to more aircraft. Suddenly, this kind of makes sport pilot real, doesn't it?
It really does. So I want to be real clear. Yes, you're absolutely right, Max, that the original sport pilot light sport aircraft rule from 2004 certainly had some handicap factors to it that limited its overall level of success and level of utilization. There's no argument about that. But what it did do is it laid the foundation for what we actually now have with Mosaic. And without that first iteration, that Sport Pilot 1.0, we never would have got to 2.0. It gave us 20 years of good data that showed that the safety aspects were there, that it was as safe as private pilots and certainly fit within the risk continuum of where this type of training lands. And it's not less training, it's more focused training. You're focused on what the skill sets that you're going to be utilizing to fly, to be able to fly in that kind of environment. And that's why we certainly feel strongly that Mosaic will be highly successful for those that want to go off and learn to fly recreationally, because it really is a focused approach that gets you there in a more affordable and more cost-effective way.
Well, before we move on to talking about the LSA aircraft themselves, let's just fully flesh this out and talk about someone who starts from scratch, becomes a sport pilot. They've got some limitations that you've talked about in terms of what they can fly and what time of day they can fly. What are the various endorsements that they can get over time that expand their capabilities while still flying as a sport pilot?
So there's quite a few, and that's another really clever aspect of Mosaic, is they've taken the training and endorsement process. So you train with the flight instructor, and then ultimately when you meet a standard, the instructor endorses you to be able to have that type of operation added to your existing sport pilot certificate. So that's going to be the case for night, although night will require either BasicMed or a third-class medical as well, but there will be training and endorsement for that. Same for complex and high performance. It'll be the same type of endorsements that you have now for privates will now be open for sport pilots to pursue. Again, as long as that airplane that's a high performance or complex airplane has a 59 knot or less stall speed clean and 4 seats or less, they'll be able to pursue that. You still have the same training and endorsements in place for towered operations so that you can fly in a Class Delta towered operation. So it really is a clever a la carte method of getting you your certification as a sport pilot and then deciding what you want to add to it and then go train with an appropriate instructor and get that endorsement as a result of that training and meeting that standard.
Yeah, I think a la carte's a good description. It sounds like what you're saying is under the sport pilot certificate, one can get started relatively inexpensively and then add on different endorsements that bring you up fairly close to what you would have gotten if you started as a private pilot from scratch.
Yeah, in a recreational sense, absolutely. I mean, you're still not going to be able to do some of the things that private pilots can do as far as charity flying and some other aspects that are in a different place on that safety continuum. But the basic elements of the types of environments that you may want to fly in or like to fly in recreationally, it absolutely does that.
So we've got a hard limit on 2 people in the airplane, right?
Correct. Correct.
Well, let's move on and talk about LSAs, the aircraft themselves. To me, one of the most interesting things is we've kind of changed the paradigm. I think in the past, the paradigm was there was pretty much a one-to-one relationship between the sport pilot certificate and LSA aircraft. And now we've separated those two. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's an important shift that a lot of folks are struggling to understand. And I get it. For the first 20 years, it was married and attached at the hip. Sport pilots could fly light sport aircrafts or standard category aircrafts that met that definition. Well, they have decoupled that. And I think it's actually ultimately really clever of why and what this will result in by doing that decoupling. So the primary decoupling is apparent in the actual definition. Now an LSA can be manufactured under the LSA ASTM process, which is a lower cost of certification. It brings down the cost of building and certifying an aircraft significantly. That type of airplane for a manufacturer now can be manufactured with up to a 61 knot dirty or landing configuration stall speed calibrated. So you now will see airplanes being manufactured under the ASTM process that perhaps a sport pilot can't fly, but a private pilot can, or a commercial pilot can. And think of the manufacturers now looking at this saying, wow, 61 knot dirty with flaps and slats and whatever type of lift augmentation device we want to employ, they can get really creative and follow this lower cost path for certifying an airplane and building an SLSA to that ASTM standard that will reinvigorate aircraft manufacturing. We're already seeing the buzz amongst many of the manufacturers saying, there's really something to be had here. We really need to dust off some designs and come up with something that fits this category because it's exciting to see.
So my understanding as I read the rules is that an aircraft such as, let's just pick a Cirrus SR-20 that was certificated back, I want to say 1999. It was a long time ago. Obviously, Mosaic rules were not available then, but if that aircraft were being certified today, could it be certified as an LSA?
I don't know what the dirty stall speed is for an SR-20, but if it's 61 knots or less, the answer is, and 4 seats, yes. You still have the basic 4-seat limitation, even though it is decoupled, but it's 61 knot dirty is the driving number now. It's a performance metric. And again, I don't know what the SR-20 has for a dirty stall speed, but there's plenty of airplanes that would meet that metric.
Right. Yeah, I looked it up. I think it does meet it. So go ahead and just dive down into this a little bit deeper. I'm an aircraft manufacturer. In the past, I certified, again, we'll just pick the SR-20. Now I might have an option if I were creating that airplane today or some other airplane that's substantially similar. Why, as a manufacturer, might I want to certify it as an LSA under the new Mosaic rules?
Well, again, as I said just a minute ago, the primary reason is cost. The ASTM process under SLSA it's a much more streamlined process. And again, it uses industry standards to create the key driving elements. It's not as prescriptive as Part 23. It's more performance-based. And there's a lot less costly factors as a manufacturer in following that pathway to producing a new airplane under SLSA. So it will excite manufacturers to come up with new designs and cause them to go down that path where under the Part 23 world, they probably would have said it's not worth it. It's still going to be an $800,000 airframe by the time we're done.
Yeah, and kind of scale it for us. In terms of cost, what percentage of cost are we looking at, or what would be a typical cost that one might expect to certify under Part 23? Give people an idea of how big a difference of cost in the entire design and certification process this could mean.
It does vary a bit, but typically it can be as low as a third to upwards of a half of lower costs of the certification costs compared to Part 23. Now they still have the liability aspects; they still have all of the basic manufacturing aspects that are not going to change, but the actual certification can be as much as a third to a half less.
Okay. So ultimately that's going to translate into lower cost because if it costs us twice as much to design an airplane, we've got to recover those costs when we're manufacturing and selling it. Talk a little bit about time to market. What's the impact there?
I think it's going to take some time as far as the new designs. That's going to take several years to see people really get a hold of that and come forward with final product. And by the way, the rule as it stands now has a 90-day implementation period for sport pilots. So all of the sport pilot aspects are going to become completely in place by what was that, October 22nd, I believe, 90 days from the 24th of July of AirVenture. And the the light sport aircraft elements, that'll need a little more time because of the development and finalization of the new ASTM standards that the ASTM committee, F-37, is already hard at work on. That'll take 365 days before that rule becomes final. So it's going to take some time, particularly on the aircraft side, to see brand new designs coming out under this. But it'll go fast. Believe me, after 10 years of waiting to see this complete to a final rule, another year or more is not going to be much.
And if I'm a manufacturer and I'm now having to decide between whether to certify under Part 23 or under Mosaic, from the time I start and say, hey, I'm going to design a new airplane to the time it's out the door, isn't that going to be a lot shorter?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because of the ASTM process is more efficient. It just works better and takes less time to go down that path. That's part of the lower cost element, frankly.
So that really has potential to speed up the evolutionary cycles of new aircraft design, right? In other words, if we look at the models like the Cessna 172, which has just celebrated its 70th birthday.
Hard to believe.
Part of the issue is that it was just so difficult to certify new aircraft that why wouldn't you just keep manufacturing the prior one as long as possible? Do you think this might just kind of speed up the cycle where we get more iterations of newer, better designs sooner?
I do. I do. I think you're going to see a wider variety too because of this. And you'll see both the bigger manufacturers finding ways to take advantage of this. And in some cases, there may be not as much energy depending on the drive and the what's behind the manufacturer. But certainly where we're seeing it right off the bat and the excitement across the grounds at AirVenture were some of the existing LSA manufacturers already that are now saying, holy cow, think of what we can build now. We've been constrained by this weight limit and what we've been able to produce to date under SLSA. Now the gloves are off, so to speak. Now we can really go after some designs that we've wanted to do all along. And that, I think, is where you're going to see some excitement. And ultimately, that'll bleed over into the larger folks saying, look what's coming down the pike and look what's coming out of some of these smaller manufacturers. We can do that. And we've seen that in other efforts, such as low-cost avionics for experimentals, where initially some of the bigger manufacturers waited and watched, and as soon as they saw what came down the pike, they went after it with zest afterwards. So it'll be fun to see how this unfolds.
What about today's kit manufacturers? Does this open up new opportunities for them?
It does, and it does on multiple fronts. So the kit manufacturers will be able to continue to make kits as they always have, and we made sure that Mosaic kept the 51% traditional experimental amateur-built pathway untouched, sacrosanct. That is still very much a viable pathway for kit manufacturers to follow and be part of. But now you'll see several of the kit manufacturers going down the SLSA path and then being able to produce ELSAs of the same types. And the ELSA has a huge advantage in that there's no more 51% limitation. So if I produce one SLSA and I then want to go ahead and produce an ELSA kit, I can produce it as a 90% complete kit. I can have it basically to the point where you then choose the interior, the sundry subtle things like what's inside avionics-wise, what I want to have customized, and have a nearly complete ELSA as a new option, which frankly, not everybody has the time anymore to build, a 500-hour or 1,000-hour or 1,500-hour home built project that this will fill that gap.
For those of us who are not as familiar with the different versions, explain the difference between SLSA and ELSA.
Yeah, so SLSA is basically your standard light sport aircraft, and that is the manufactured from stem to stern complete aircraft that is then sold to the market. ELSA is basically an SLSA then that's produced as a kit. And to what level of completion is completely up to the manufacturer. So you could produce it as a bare bones kit. You could and the key thing is now you have that the design standard behind it that the SLSA achieved that ultimately makes for a safer and better product in the end. You'll see that in like the van series. Certainly the RV-12 is a great example of an SLSA that has a very good safety record and has all the right elements. I think we'll see more of that on the ELSA side. Again, the key driving force there is no more 51% limitation. You'll still see plenty of 51% kits that are out there for the traditional home builder types. That's always going to be a major part of what this organization is about. But you now will have ELSAs that can fill that void or fill that gap for a more complete kit that is going to require less time to complete to a flying aircraft.
Okay. So you brought up safety. Talk a little bit about what we know about safety of sport pilot certificate. I'm sure most people would take a look and go, whoa, wait a minute, 20 hours and I can get a sport pilot? That doesn't sound like a very good pilot. Now, you, of course, pointed out that people are spending closer to 35 or 40 hours. So there are probably very few people getting a certificate with 20 hours. But what do the data tell us about how successful, safety-wise, sport pilots have been?
So when you really look at the data and dive into it deeply, the entire first iteration of sport pilot and light sport aircraft, the accidents that were occurring were because of the aircraft themselves had different handling characteristics. And in many cases, much lighter airframes as far as wing loading and responsiveness that were causing the problem. So the basic element of training and meeting those standards and then taking a check ride with an examiner is still ensuring a very safe, very capable pilot. The problem was the aircraft and the qualities of those aircraft that, especially for transitioning existing pilot certificate holders like private and commercial that were not used to those handling qualities. Well, guess what? With Mosaic, that goes away. You now can continue to fly the types that you're most familiar with. So there's really, from a safety standpoint, nothing bad about this. And people that look at it and try to take pokes at, well, wait a minute, it's 35 hours. How can you be as safe? It's not 35 hours. It's meeting a standard and it's passing a check ride for a focused set of tasks that are most appropriate for the type of flying you're going to do.
And when you're talking about handling characteristic, the one that comes to mind would be kind of pitch sensitivity.
You bet.
You get into the flare and suddenly the amount of pull you're used to making on a 172 is just going to be a tiny fraction of that in the original LSA aircraft.
That's exactly right, Max. And again, with Mosaic, that aspect goes away.
That's great. What excites you the most about this? And also, where do you think we go next from here?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things that excite me about Mosaic. And seeing it have a meaningful impact to general aviation and the vibrancy that is so important about general aviation. It's what fuels so many other aspects of aviation as a whole. General aviation fuels the airlines. Ab initio training has had varying degrees of success, and I believe GA is a much more impactful way to create folks that are then going off to fly professionally. General aviation as a whole is such an important part of our communities and the airport infrastructure and the reasons why we have a good face forward to the general public is because of the vibrancy of general aviation. And Mosaic is going to continue to grow that and develop that. And that's the game changer to me. To see how that's going to impact and continue to evolve that, I think is where our greatest opportunities lie. And most importantly, to see new people come into flying that before and previously would have said, I can't do that. To see turnover rates significantly dropped from a flight instructor standpoint so that, as you're coming into the fold and learning to fly, you have one flight instructor that gets you through the whole certification process. You have a lower dropout rate from a student pilot start standpoint. Right now, what's the number? 70% of folks that start private pilots don't finish. I guarantee you with Sport Pilot, that number will be flipped. You'll see less than 30% dropout because it's more efficient, it's more effective. You're staying with the same instructor more likely, and you're completing in just a few months instead of a year and a half.
Well, you and I both love general aviation. Your passion comes through very strongly. I want to thank you so much for all of the efforts that you've spent over the last 20 years helping make these kinds of things come to fruition.
Well, thank you, Max. And as you know, those of us that have that passion, it's in our DNA. It's in our blood. It's been part of our lives our entire life, right? I sold it on my 16th birthday. I'll forever be a GA advocate because it's been so important to my life. And I think all of us, yourself included, can have some of the same stories about why GA is so meaningful.
Well, and it's great fun too, right?
It is, absolutely.
Sean, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Max, thanks for having me on.
And my thanks to Sean Elliott for joining us here today. You can read more about Mosaic at eaa.org/mosaic. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down. You can always